Welcome everyone to the 171st in the series of urban workshops, which are organized by CPR and CSH collaboratively, and they're always held on the last Tuesday of every month, and we look forward as organizers to having them, and welcome to everyone who's been a regular here and to those who are coming here for the first time. This time we have a speaker who is here from Miami University, Ohio, Indivar Janalagadda. He has been familiar to those of us here at CPR because he used to work at the Hyderabad Urban Labs with whom CPR has had a close collaboration. But I'm really excited about his work today, which is looking at real estate in Hyderabad, and he's terming this unreal estate in a global city. Slums in Hyderabad as auto-constructed property markets. As someone who's interested in housing myself, I can't wait to hear how he's theorized housing. I mean, we've all read so many papers on informality and housing, and it's been a subject of theorization for decades now. But it's always interesting that researchers come and look at it in their own unique way, and how different field sites actually contribute new discourses, new things to the discourse. So welcome, Indivar. Really happy to have you here. And I would just hand this over to you, and we will take all our questions at the end of your talk. So you have 45 minutes to present. For the audience, as usual, you're welcome to put in your queries in the Q&A. But the custom that we follow is at the end of the talk, we also just bring in speakers to ask questions directly. So you can also just raise your hand and hold on to your questions and raise your hand at the end of the talk. So we'll listen to Indivar now. Welcome again.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for coming here to hear me speak about my research. Let me begin with a couple of thank yous. I'm coming to you from the office of Hyderabad Urban Lab, and I can't overstate how much HUL has been to my journey as a researcher over the last 10 years. Also, huge thank you to Mukta Nayak for inviting me to present at this workshop. It's an honor to present at the CPR CSH workshop. And I should note that, working at HUL and Hyderabad over the years, I always look to CPR Urban as a sort of pillar of stability and leadership in urban research. So it's also been very troubling to witness the things that have been happening in the recent past. But I'm really glad to be here in this space. Finally, thanks to my interlocutors who shared their stories with me and even shared documents which you'll see in my talk. My interlocutors are people from Dalit, OBC, and Muslim backgrounds. And this research kind of talks about their aspirations for property and citizenship and the limits that they face in pursuing these. So let me get started. In the spirit of the workshop, what I'm presenting today is a work in progress chapter of my book project, which is tentatively titled Permanent Slums, the Limits to Property and Citizenship for the Urban Poor in Hyderabad. And thanks to Mukta for the reminder of the decades of work that have happened on these subjects. I'm always conscious of that, and I hope that this adds something of interest, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback to kind of build this out. The piece I'm presenting today follows a chapter in my book about the process of granting conditional titles to slum residents, which I've also preliminarily analyzed in an IJ publication. In this chapter that I'm presenting today, I'm shifting away from state-sanctioned legal titles to look at the property relations and markets that exist beyond them. An emphasis on property was a small change I made in my ethnographic questions, but it made a huge difference in my fieldwork. So from 2014 to 2018, I was consistently driven by questions of housing, basic services, infrastructure, social spending, development, etc. While my interlocutors would respond to those questions with a wide range of important and influential attitudes and approaches, one thing that constantly stuck out to me was they always presented a counter framing or a counter questioning in terms of property. So in 2019, when I started my year of dissertation fieldwork, I decided to inculcate that language of property into my project to begin there. And the shift in framing shifted entirely the range of sites and subjectivities that were the ambit of my research. Let me begin with the scene. On a humid August afternoon in 2019, I was standing outside a small godown filled with old electronic appliances where two men were dismantling an old washing machine. I'd just been introduced to the older of these men, Wakaruddin Bhai. At the time, he was in the process of registering property subdivisions between himself and his siblings. I asked if I could talk to him about his experiences of dealing with the property bureaucracy sometime, to which he responded, "What are you doing tomorrow? I'm going to meet my lawyer. Come along with me." So the next day, I accompanied Wakaruddin Bhai on this trip to the office of a document writer. A document writer drafts the documents also known as deeds used for various kinds of property transactions. In this case, to specify the terms of the property subdivision that Wakaruddin Bhai and his family were undertaking. The document writer's office was composed of two rooms. In the front room was a reception where a young assistant was painstakingly rendering hand-drawn property layouts into a digital software. And the second room had a large desk at which sat the document writer, Mr. Subramaniam, who has a law degree and is currently in the business of consulting and supporting people's applications for property registration. This is the man whom Wakaruddin Bhai referred to as his lawyer. Indeed, when we walked in, Mr. Subramaniam recognized Wakaruddin Bhai, but I noticed immediately that he had an air of condescension. Wakaruddin said, "I brought the papers you asked for," to which Subramaniam briskly replied, "Fine, leave them at the front desk." And then he looked away. With these cursory instructions, Wakaruddin was evidently being dismissed without entertaining further questions. In hardly 2 minutes, it seemed that Wakaruddin's meeting with his lawyer was over. Even as Wakaruddin was joining hands in deference and preparing to leave, Mr. Subramaniam pulled out his lunchbox to move on with his day, at which point he looked quizzically at the stranger in the room, me. He asked, "What are you here for? Are you with this man?" I was also starting to wonder what I was doing there. My intention was to accompany Wakaruddin Bhai and observe his maneuverings through these kinds of para-bureaucratic offices. I'd visited offices before with fieldwork interlocutors, but usually in groups, so they were never so easily dismissed. Building on that experience, I was subconsciously expecting things to go smoothly. I had also imbibed Wakaruddin's confidence from his statements about meeting his lawyer. I'd imagined that I would find a well delineated process through which I could simply shadow him and observe happenings as a fly on the wall. But I was taken aback by the briskness of the interaction and stood out in that moment as an English speaking upper caste man accompanying a non elite Muslim man. I gathered myself and told the document writer about my project, that I was interested in property registration and record keeping in the city, and that I was doing research. Up to this point, we were speaking in Hindi or Urdu, which is the tongue Wakaruddin Bhai was most comfortable with. The document writer responded in Hindi with some suggestions about my research, but at this point, remembering that Wakaruddin Bhai was still in the room, and after casting a quick glance at him, he switched to Telugu, presuming that Wakaruddin would not understand, and said, "Ilanti chadu leni vallu, uneducated and ignorant people like this come to my office often. We draw up documents for them for minimal cost since they are unable to do it themselves. But they don't know what they're doing. You're wasting your time looking at property in those spaces, that's slums. Go to the outskirts of the city, that's where the real deals are taking place." So, although I walked into that office expecting to find the much fabled Indian jugaad, I left with a clear reminder that in the space of formal regulatory processes, despite their potential flexibility, some people are denied recognition. In contrast to the real deals taking place in the booming land markets of the urban periphery, the property wranglings of people like Wakaruddin were a matter of course, less real, even unreal. They were just predictable compromises between the state and the poor. But Wakaruddin had his own take on this. On the motorbike ride leaving from Subramaniam's office, I was riding behind him on a motorbike, And I was uncomfortable that the document writer had insulted Wakaruddin and I'd said nothing in response. Wakaruddin perhaps sensed my discomfort and told me as we drove forward that he understood that the advocate called him uneducated. I apologized to him immediately for not saying anything, to which he responded, "No, it's good you were silent. I have to act uneducated. He can't know about my properties and the investments that I'm making, that I've even tried to procure old stamp papers. I need to act that way because then he'll do my work for 10 rupees." He laughed at my discomfort as we drove into the bus. From Wakaruddin's position, the marginalization and condescension he experienced was just one necessary performance of the wider repertoire of practices by which his property claims in the city are assembled. Even as the question of property relations revealed new spaces and subjectivities in my fieldwork, from the very outset, it also brought to the fore the structural inequalities and limits that shape property markets in the slum. Many urban studies have depicted a dichotomy of a formal sphere of procedural governance and an informal sphere of negotiation. But what I found was not dichotomous spheres with divergent norms. Instead, I found stratified and differentiated procedures and criteria operating in the same offices with respect to the same laws and through similar practices of documentation and claim making. But Wakaruddin Bhai and most of my other interlocutors have to do more work more consistently to unregister their property claims. And in the face of mistrustful scrutiny, harsher judgment, and severe discrimination and humiliation. So, in contrast to writing that thinks about these marginal properties in terms of their alterity or relative autonomy, which are important dimensions, I show instead the wider structures of subordination occurring through legal and policy protocols within which this relative autonomy exists. This subordination happens through policy protocols, not through omissions or exceptions. I argue that Wakaruddin Bai's tactical confidence about his property is another side of the same coin as his humiliating treatment in a bureaucratic office. And in this paper, I consider both sides of the proverbial coin. Firstly, the practices by which property rights and claims are wrangled in an unstable economy of claims and possession through what I call legal pragmatics. And secondly, the entrenched structures of exclusion and humiliation embodied by what I call stratified markets. So, in the rest of the talk, I consider the performative work that goes into producing private property in Hyderabad slums. I do so by describing a widely prevalent system known as no entry, which I'll also discuss in terms of legal pragmatics. And I also examine the aspirations for property ownership and how they play out in socially stratified markets for property. In conclusion, I'll argue that some property is a kind of unreal estate, an unstable asset and commodity in the lives of slum dwelling communities, and a subordinated and exceptional territorial category in relation to the wider political economy of land in the city. So, in debates on land tenure and property rights in slums, the relations of slum communities to the land has often been described as a sort of collective right, as a realm of the non private and non corporate, and hence a counterpoint to the formal capitalistic city. I'm thinking here of the work of Kalyan Sanyal or Solomon Benjamin. It's further been argued that this becomes even more visible when threatened by state apparatuses of dispossession, which compel communities to enact what Ananya Roy and others have described as a possessive collectivism. While these frameworks informed my ethnography, they were also reopened for examination. Because when I conducted interviews and asked people about the relation of their communities to the land they live on, people always unflinchingly responded, it's privately owned. Private ownership for my interlocutors was not an attained and certified state supported by state sanctioned documentary infrastructures, but a process of everyday inhabitation and aspiration. In some cases, government documents like a patta or a land title are part of their repertoire for making property claims. But more often, private ownership is not verified by the letter of statutory law alone. It's an assembled legitimacy which emerges from diverse, even contradictory sources of authority and relies on a variety of performative assertions. So by centering this assembly and assertion of property rights, I propose the concept of legal pragmatics to describe the discourses and practices through which my interlocutors become socially recognizable as having rightful possession over a piece of land. To do so, they navigate property markets constituted by a plurality of legal ideologies and structured by a number of social formations. I propose thinking of stratified markets as the supervening structure which shapes the legal pragmatics of different socioeconomic classes in the city. Here, I particularly focus on the legal pragmatics of the poor in response to a number of structural obstacles. Firstly, the effective exclusion from the sphere of clear private property ownership. Second, the racialized framing of the actually existing property claims and neighborhoods, as also shown by Malini Ranganathan. Third, the absence of reliable procedures through which they can attest their property claims and get them recognized. And finally, the deregulation of the land, finance, rental, and infrastructure markets that they participate in. All these together structure property units that are bought and sold on the markets existing in Hyderabad slums. So, in one of my earliest fieldwork experiences in 2014, just as I was beginning to understand the tenure diversity of Hyderabad slums, I was in a bylane of a large basti in Hyderabad. I was talking to three women in the post lunch hours. They were sitting on their front stoops, taking a short break between the day's chores. I was asking them various questions about access to water and sanitation infrastructure in relation to housing. And I also asked if they had pattas to the land they lived on. One of them said, Nahi, patta nahi hai, no entry hai. No, there's no title, it's no entry. To which another responded, Yahan pe sabich no entry hai. No entry hi no entry. It's all no entry here, no entry all around. And she laughed. Two other women sitting nearby joined in the laughter, and I'll return to this laughter later. In Hyderabad slums, for many, but not all, but many slum residents, there's no recognition of property rights from the government. Others have government assigned property rights which prohibit transfers. In these conditions, residents transfer land in unregulated markets and they ratify and contractually document property locally and socially. This is done through a system called no entry. The procedure involves signing a sale deed on government stamp paper in the presence of a notary public. And I'll describe this documentation in some detail in a second. Because of the notary, this system of transaction is called notary, which in many places has gotten creatively corrupted into no entry. The irony of claiming no entry in spite of law is a self-conscious assertion. Even for the non-English speaking slum dwellers involved in the process, the term no entry is ironic and self-conscious, and it signals proprietary and exclusive boundaries that sit uncomfortably with the statutory laws. And this irony is also represented by that laughter that comes along with the utterance no entry. Let's look closely at a couple of versions of this document which I'll analyze with an eye to not just the content, but also the graphic arrangement and tactics of documentation following Matthew Hull's approach. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is a very rudimentary version of the no entry. This is the no entry of Mumtaz B, which consists merely of a stamp paper with a handwritten statement naming the parties to the transaction, the address of the property, and the monetary amount involved, which is then stamped by the notary and signatures of local leaders are added. But there can be much more elaborate versions of the document, which much more closely imitate formal registered sales. So the example that I'll be using is the transfer of property from Peddamma to Deepa. And this document depicts a range of these striking features that I mentioned. But before I get into it, just a quick aside to note that all these property documents are transactions are happening in the name of women. Mumtaz B is a Muslim woman. Peddamma and Deepa are Dalit women. In slums in the lower economic bracket, one predominantly finds property in the name of women. This comes from the fact that the non-transferable patta, if granted, will be in the woman's name. So in anticipation, even no-entry property transactions are made in the woman's name. I talk about this women's property question in another chapter, but I can touch on it in the Q&A. But let's return to the document. Firstly, there are two parties involved in the transaction, the seller and the buyer. For these parties to come together, there must be the involvement of at least one, if not two brokers. Brokers are the conduits of information, so they could be relatives who passed on the information merely for goodwill, but they could also be a professional broker who would collect a fee for the information. Two other preconditions must be satisfied to enable a transaction between Peddama and Deepa. One, Peddama, the seller, must have some documented claim to the land. This could be a patta, or it could be a previous no entry document, thus forming a documentary chain. On the buyer side, Deepa has to have the funds available to pay Peddama. In rare cases, this might be savings accumulated by the buyer, but that's highly unlikely. And in most cases, these are loans gathered from family and relatives, perhaps from informal money lenders at significantly high interest rates. Though in general, I did not encounter anyone who got loans from a formal financial institution for property transactions. Then Peddama and Deepa drew up a sale deed to document this transaction. They visited a document writer who has the professional know-how and the legalese that would go into such a deed. And Peddama provided accurate information about the property. That sale deed is then printed on a stamp paper from the government. Before the sale deed can go forward, one further step is required in slum transactions, which is verification or validation by local leaders. So Peddama and Deepa had to approach the leaders of the slum. In this case, there was an elected body, but it could be some kind of slumlord or other power broker. And they acquired the blessings of these leaders. And to gain this blessing, both Peddama and Deepa paid a sum of 40,000 rupees each to these leaders. The rationale for this payment is as a kind of tax or a duty to ensure the protection and services provided by the leader. Once this condition is satisfied and the leaders have been paid, they too add their signatures to the sale deed to attest their blessings. Now, this stamp paper is taken to the notary public, who is certified by the state as a notary, to attest the sale deed involving this property transaction. So until this point of being signed by a notary, the transaction process imitates the procedures followed in any segment of the real estate market, except that the stamp paper is of a nominal value like rupees 50 or 100, or sometimes even less. But here a divergence occurs. The vital additional step of getting approval and registration from the registration department of the state is not taken. You might notice at the bottom of the page to the right, there's a stamp which says subject to registration. This is the crucial ellipsis in the document. While any sale of property must be registered with the registration department, these sales which are not backed by an already registered property claim cannot be registered. So why even create this document and put that stamp there? Essentially, the no entry documents those transactions that are, for various reasons, unable to approach the state registration department, but they are indefinitely in anticipation of future registration. The transaction both implicitly and explicitly invokes the state at various points, and in fact directly relies on the state actor. Some other features of this document. A conspicuous absence in the document is the word land. The no entry carefully defines the object of property as a house, which is also clever because in some settlements, the walls of houses tend to be congruent with the boundaries of the land. While rights over land may be absent, the property claims being made are anchored to the house, which was a product of the residents' labor and investment. And they have a range of other documents to attest to their possession of the house, including a house number from the municipal corporation. The piece of land, on the other hand, is not actually enumerated by the revenue department as its own unit. In this no entry that we're looking at, further imitation of the registration process is found in the section titled Schedule of Property, which not only lists the house number and survey number of the land, but also specifies the neighboring properties and names their owners, thus generating a citational chain across documents that cross-reference and ratify each other. In cities like Hyderabad, this is essentially the same technique used to cross-reference and ratify all property in the city. Now, I selected this particular case because I happen to have access to two versions of this no entry. The first one was not signed by the notary officer and had some other features. The second one, which you're looking at, was revised in some regards and then did get the stamp of the notary officers. But the two documents were presented to me as a single seamless file. This is the no entry. Now, the first edition candidly mentions that Peddamma wants to sell the property because she needs money. But that line was edited out in the second edition. And instead, they inserted a statement asserting that Peddamma had the right to alienate the property. The document also includes a clause, the second version also includes a clause that states the rights, titles, interests, easements, privileges, liberties, enjoyments, and possessions are hereby transferred in favor of the vendee, absolutely and forever, again imitating the language of the property title sale deeds that you might see at a registration department. And through this, it signals that the bundle of rights which were held by Padma are being passed on to Deepa. About this system, I spoke to a number of notaries who all agreed that these transactions take place, but also they claimed that they personally do not engage in them and stated that the practice is illegal and a punishable offense. But by adding this subject to registration stamp, perhaps as a protection against liability, it's clear that many notary publics are participating in this economy, which has come to be named for them after all. So in this slide, it's essential to move past a language of legality and illegality, or even formality and informality, which I think is misleading. And we need to move towards understanding legal pragmatics and different strategies, and how it draws on a range of sources of authority for efficacy and assertability, and then whose claims are actually seen as valid. So what is the legal validity of no entry? To investigate this question, I tracked the pragmatic value of no entries within the bureaucratic field of property governance mediated by brokers and government officers. To figure out more about this, I hung around the offices of registration consultants and attached myself to one agent whom I'll call Rahul. Rahul is a young professional in his late 20s, but he runs his own registration consultancy. Now, as many of you will surely know, if you go to a government office, especially a registration office, there'll be posters on their premises prohibiting the engagement of brokers or saying that brokers are not allowed. So as a result, brokers near registration offices have started calling themselves registration consultants. So when I asked him questions about bureaucratic procedures, Rahul would slip into dictating rote-learned protocols for how to get specific kinds of documents registered. But he also punctuated this description with comments on how he advises his clients on assembling linked documents to verify property claims when they do not neatly fit the protocols. If the linked documents are accepted and the registration process for a property is completed, Rahul called it 100% government certified. At various points, I'd ask him doubts I had about the process. So, what if I don't have XYZ documents? And he said there's always ways out if you can't provide linked documents. And Rahul would sometimes add in an undertone, well, there are ways, and he'd make the sign for money, but we mustn't talk about that, he'd say. But property registration is an onerous and expensive bureaucratic process. And it's also a legal pragmatic option, which is exclusive to the small sphere of formally registered properties in the city. Many people can't afford it. Many want to avoid the hassle of forging linked documents or bribing registrars. And lastly, many in spaces like slums are prohibited from transacting property due to their conditional property rights. All these people constitute the realm of no entry transactions, engaging in a more specialized legal pragmatics to engage to and register their claims to property ownership. Upon learning of all these mechanisms, I had an anthropologist's impulse to interpret the situation as a legal pluralism, but Rahul saw it differently. As I mentioned above, if a transaction is registered with the registration department, Rahul calls it 100% government certified. When I asked him about the no entry process, he said no entry is 80% government certified, a figure that he stated matter of factly without any moral judgment. Rahul's schema of 100 versus 80% government certified, which involves either paying the registration duty upfront or deferring it until the opportunity presents itself, operates not as a legal pluralism, but in his view, it's like different versions of a subscription. People either have the right documents and the money to get 100% subscription with all the attendant benefits in the present, or they stop at the point where they can defer the full subscription to a future point in time, when either they're able to afford it or the government offers them avenues to attain this 100% certification through processes known as regularization. Now, in the US, I usually have to explain what regularization is, but I'm confident you all know what I'm talking about. So I'll move on. While Rahul, as a broker, is nonchalant about the 80% or 100% certification, for the many people who have these no entry documents, which are supposedly 80% certified, the impediments to full subscription have a historic weight and are tied to questions of citizenship. Many studies of property making around the world point to the moment of this full subscription being perceived by groups on a variety of property frontiers as the inauguration of history, as the incorporation into citizenship, as seen in the works of James Holston or Christian Lund. Yet my interlocutors were also troubled and frustrated by the fact that their no entry properties continue to exist as a form of sub registration occurring off of the government's record. As a result, their legal pragmatics for asserting their private ownership is affected not through linear and rational culminations of bureaucratic and technical processes, but rather relationally and circuitously, and it includes various performative and discursive strategies. In addition to documents, they must represent themselves as productive members of societies, as developed and clean residents, as taxpayers, or as members of civil society. All of these are part of their repertoire of performing citizenship and property. Although they cannot have cooperative housing societies, they form basti welfare associations and often caste associations among subgroups. All these factors together with documents like the no entry, or if lucky, a non-transferable patta, add up to tenuously and register their private ownership. But the documents are important because they make them legible to the state, even if legally ambiguous. So for example, in January 2008, Deepa and her husband Murthy from the no entry transaction we were discussing earlier were among many applicants for legal titles from the state. Upon the announcement of a scheme for poor households to get legal titles to the land they occupy, they submitted this application. And in the application, they responded with an unambiguous no to two key questions about ownership, namely the possession of a registered sale deed or having permission to construct. Nonetheless, they have a house on that site with an electricity connection, and they wrote in notary, another way to say no entry, as a form of documentary proof into a space on the form which was not actually meant to be filled in. Now, although unsuccessful in 2008 when they first applied, in 2015, under a different regularization drive, they did receive a title to the land that they occupy. But the acquisition of this title alone didn't mean that Deepa and Murthy are now incorporated into the realm of formal property. On the contrary, they actually see little point to this new land title, especially because the title does not allow the transfer of rights over the land to someone else. Deepa told me, it doesn't do anything, it's useless. Thus, gaining the title is also merely one other aspect of their legal pragmatics and does not simply obviate or replace other practices like no entry and other strategies. So Deepa's property file today is a stack of papers, including the patta, including this application, including the various versions of the no entry, both stamped and unstamped, and all other receipts from the state related to the house. The legal pragmatics of households and slums thus consists of a wide set of discourses and practices, much more than just documentation. It takes a lot of work. It includes such basic practices as construction of brick walls, maintaining relations with political patrons, and piecing together municipal service provision. So in Deepa and Murthy's application for government titles, notary and no entry stand in as one page in a wider array of documents and practices through which their private ownership is effected. I make this point about the work of property making because it applies more broadly too. To zoom out from the slum for a moment, Property itself, in any context, must be understood in its fuller social, economic, and cultural context by attending to the bundles and networks of relations it encapsulates. This imbrication of intersecting social roles and personae into the category of citizenship suggests important ways to unpack citizenship as not only a political and legal category, but as a multidimensional structure which involves important economic dimensions. This is also paralleled in the regulated property market, where people engage in a range of practices to register their ownership, as I'm sure some of you have. Uh, Everyone is engaging in legal pragmatics. But if you have a privileged physical and social location in the city, you are afforded more standardized rules, more efficient and effective shortcuts and loopholes. And finally, you are granted clear property rights. This demands an attention to how slum property relations are set apart and differentiated. And I analyze those through the lens of stratified markets. And I build on the narrative of Lata Aunty, a domestic worker who wants to own property in the city. I'm sitting beside Lata Aunty in the passenger seat of an auto rickshaw owned by her and her husband, who is driving us. We're on our way to a State Bank of India branch in Banjara Hills. Lata Aunty does not have her own house in Hyderabad. She's a tenant in a basti nearby. But as long as I've known her, she's wanted to procure a house of her own and has been investing time and money in a variety of schemes that could get her that piece of land in the city. In 2017, I first learned of her interest in acquiring land. At the time, she brought it up as a matter of course. She had paid a few thousand rupees as lump sum to a leader from the CPIM and who was promising Lata Aunty and many others land in the Santosh Nagar area of Hyderabad. At the time, she would occasionally be ferried with many others on open trucks to the site of the occupation. I asked her, "Do you trust these people?" And she said she was willing to give it a try and that she finds the leaders persuasive and reliable. Incidentally, one of my research contacts was the city secretary of the CPIM, who I called soon after this and asked if he was aware of this activity. And he said he was completely unaware of any such program. And I passed this information on, but decided not to say any more. The next year, in 2018, I returned to Hyderabad for summer research. Lata Aunty had still not acquired the land in Santosh Nagar, but had subsequently invested even more money in the scheme. What she was part of is a well known process that has been documented across the world and has been called pirate urbanization in Latin America, for example. It's a form of land invasion occurring through markets where people pay for small plots of land and for protection. In 2019, the next year, Latanti was no longer very hopeful about acquiring land for the CPIM leader. She had set her sights elsewhere. She had recently inherited a small portion of agricultural land from her maternal family. With a real property title to a small piece of land, she was eager to get hands on finance to invest in an urban property. She showed me her documents and asked about her prospects for getting a loan. I'd looked up the terms on which she might get a loan for the title she had, but the prospects didn't look great. In a longer interview conducted in 2020, she reflected on her attempts to get land through the CPIM leader. She told me, "The leader wanted us to go squat on a piece of land in the back of Beyond. But we're city people with jobs. We can't afford to do that. But whatever happens, I must have my own property in Hyderabad and I must have a patta." So I offered to accompany Auntie to the bank to see if I could help with the communication, or at least prevent her from being summarily rejected as I had heard of so many others. Which brings me back to the auto rickshaw ride. The short auto rickshaw ride of about 2 kilometers took a few quick minutes when we reached the bank. The SBI branch was mostly empty as the closing hours approached. We were given an audience with the manager to discuss the possibility of a loan. A young man who was probably my age then, 4 years ago, greeted us politely and brought an extra chair to his cubicle so all three of us could sit. He said, "Cheppandi Amma, what can I do for you, Amma?" Latanti looked at me and I nodded encouragingly. She looked back at him and said, "I want a loan to buy property." He asked what kind of property and what kind of loan. Auntie brought out her property title and showed it to him and said, "Whatever loan this might give me access to." He looked at it carefully, then he returned it and said, "Amma, I can't help you with this. You'd have to take it to a bank in the same rural area where the land is. They might have some way to help you." I asked some follow-up questions about the prospects of getting a loan if she took it to the bank in a rural area. And the manager was skeptical, but said she'd get more accurate information only at that bank branch. I asked if Auntie had any further questions, and she shook her head, and her eyes betrayed her profound disappointment. We left the bank in a somber mood. Outside the bank, as we were filing into the auto rickshaw, I suggested to Latanti that she might try to acquire a property as no entry, perhaps in a basti in the city limits. I said this hesitantly, but that seemed the clearest way forward to me, drawing on everything I'd learned about legal pragmatics from my fieldwork. I'd also perceived, based on research, that these property claims were quite secure, especially in the core city of Hyderabad. Latanti didn't say anything, but her body language told me I should stop talking. She didn't even pause to consider the idea. After all, she knew much better than me that she could opt for a no entry. After a few minutes of quiet as we drove away from the bank, she broke the silence. We want a property title. Maku pattai kawali. That's it. There must be a way. I'll assemble the money. Building on Latanti's experience and many others like her, I've come to rethink some property markets, not as an alternate or distinct parallel market, but as a subordinate one. The no entry is not just sub-registration, but it indexes a subordinate form of property. One might say subaltern property. The full symbolic weight of the 80% versus 100% government certification in Rahul's schema is not perceived by everyone as a strategic weighting. For Lata Aunty and others, the humiliating charge of exclusion, subordination, is more acutely experienced. For her, not only are markets socially structured, they also in turn structure her future social agency. For example, in my case, property markets are not just about access to property, but also imbricated with sites for auto constructing, a politics of urbanism, infrastructure, and citizenship, and simultaneously sites for state and market projects that differentiate and splinter urbanism, infrastructure, and citizenship. Property seems promising as a pathway to enacting civility and experiencing dignity for slum dwelling populations, as much as it is for elites. Having an asset to fall back on to access loans, having the ability to grow is an important marker of status in slums as well. But the no entry system built on specialized and limited legal pragmatics and the auto constructed citizenship it enables has many limits and perpetuates a socio-economic stratification. In recent years, Hyderabad has consistently either ranked first or second in a global real estate industry index called the City Momentum Index, created by Jones Lang in the South. In juxtaposition with these indicators of Hyderabad's ascendancy as a global city are these subaltern properties in the slum settlements of Hyderabad, which are home to more than 2 million people. In the lexicon of the global real estate industry and agencies like the World Bank, these lands are locked up and are a source of distortion for the smooth functioning of real estate markets. In the offices of the state, these locked away lands are permanent territories of poverty, and the urban poor are only afforded non-alienable property rights by law. By discounting the economic agency in this way, the state precludes them from being formal participants in land markets. Thus, while on the one hand, Hyderabad is smoothing the way for international real estate investments and opening its markets to global speculation and accumulation, on the other hand, its slum dwellers are excluded from formal property markets and are forced to participate in markets that are totally unregulated in search of housing and finance. So the no entry property regime can be seen as an auto-constructed form of property, which is legally fraught, limited in scope and fungibility, and politically vulnerable, which leads me to the provocation of thinking about unreal estate in a global city like Hyderabad. Through this work, I want to bring back attention to the market as an attention to the construction and negotiation of various social structures. In doing so, I'm building on the work of Barbara Harris White, who has shown through many wonderful studies about the social structuring of accumulation and economic activity. I also build on the work of Suryakant Vagmore, who argues for examining struggles for civil recognition among the marginalized as sites where the boundaries of civil society are constructed and contested. And I also build on Asim Prakash's work on the adverse incorporation of Dalits into market spaces. Thus, I rethink the fractured and hierarchized constitution of civil society in Indian cities by reconnecting civil society with the question of markets and economic exchange. This paper reveals that stratified markets essentially encode different degrees of access to the status of civility because of the barriers they pose to specific people and their striving to move beyond structures of humiliation and stigma bound up in caste, class, and other differentiators. Um, and in conclusion, I'll share one last theme from my fieldwork and end with some reflections on the limits of this kind of auto-constructed property and citizenship. In early March 2020, before the onset of COVID-19 pandemic in India or the lockdown, a different crisis had briefly transformed my fieldwork. This was the enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 and its attendant promised process of compiling a national register of citizens. It's hard to recreate the fear and uncertainty these policies and laws had animated at the time in my field sites. In Hyderabad, there were protests taking place regularly, with the largest protest bringing more than 10,000 people to one place. There were conversations everywhere in these bastis about what it means for the government to create a national register of citizens. Will they ask everyone to prove citizenship? Can any of them be confident about their documents? In the slums of Hyderabad, the situation, of course, was tenuous. So, in one of the mixed settlements where I do my work, one afternoon I came across a few houses, all of which belonged to Muslim owners. And there were name plates on their gates that had signs outside their front doors that said in English and Urdu written in Roman letters, "My door is closed to CAA agents. मेरा दरवाजा CAA agents के लिए बंद है. हम कागज नहीं दिखाएंगे. We will not show papers." This, of course, made me nervous to approach them, so I never found out more about these signs. Paranoia about state surveillance and any kind of surveyor was at an all-time high in those days. But these signs themselves were politically charged and symbolically remarkable for being hung on gateways and doors to houses. Just like the no entry document, and I'm sure these properties would be no entry properties, these signs declared no entry to the state. Until this point in time, I was quite confident that no entry properties in the city would be safeguarded by democratic politics, by the possessive collectivism of people. But the National Citizen Register, and the fascist politics that engendered it have given me reason to be alarmed. So today, I would not have recommended to Lata to pursue this. Across Indian cities, including metropolitan centers like New Delhi and Bangalore, we're witnessing a rise of bulldozer Raj that's conveniently instrumentalizing legal ambiguity to target informal settlements of other minorities, primarily Muslims. While there's an argument to be made for the fact that the system of no entry works to a degree, the changing political situation is one among many pressures that raises important questions about the long-term viability of auto-constructed legality and civility, and the continuing legal differentiation of property along axes of gender, caste, and class in a global city. And so this work will continue to delve into the question of markets and differentiated kinds of markets and stratified markets. But I'll stop here for today, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Indivar. That was fascinating. It was particularly fascinating because the term no entry also is so local, and the similar kind of documentation has different names in different places. And I'm sure people who are attending this webinar from their own fieldwork we can quickly assemble a glossary of various terms that means almost the same thing. But just I know that for a long time in your talk, while people think up of their questions and raise their hands and put things in this Q&A box, I will just get things rolling by offering one provocation. But that is only because I'm waiting for other folks to put their hands up. So everyone in the audience, please, feel free to raise the hands so that I can bring you into the conversation. But through your talk, Indivar, I was, sort of at some point you said that there seemed to be a stability of inner city slums, meaning that they weren't really at the risk, or at least the forefront of the risk of eviction. And then at the end, you talk about these changing regimes of the state, and the kind of fear of surveillance, etc. So that um, that sort of situation is so different from city to city. When you're theorizing a concept like this, and you do ask yourself that question, I'm just wondering, how do we reflect, or how do we look at this idea of this ladder of tenure, or these kind of, what you're calling as pragmatics, in the face of a change in the way that the state is looking at informal settlement. So that seems to be shifting, or at least there are indications that it could be shifting. So did you like want to say something about the fact that it may not be as stable, or is Hyderabad actually a case where there are some particular reasons where you can say that there is reasonable amount of stability, and the 80% is actually perceived
Right.
80% by people? Because for a lot of us, like, it's quite surprising that the agent actually called
Yeah.
entry 80%. I was thinking he'll say 30 or 40, and then you said, drop this jaw-dropping
Yes.
figure of 80, which
Yeah.
took me by surprise. And so Rosama Thomas also, she shared a few links, and she's also asking the same question. So I'll try and get her into the conversation.
Sure.
Rosama, you can actually unmute yourself and ask your question. I think I have sort of set the ball rolling in the same direction, but feel free to ask. And meanwhile, I'm waiting for other folks to come in with questions.
Uh, yeah, thank you. It was a very interesting and very informative presentation. See, when reading about Ayodhya and other places, one gets to know that people who have lived in the same house across generations, they were not compensated because they didn't have documents to show. So it's really scary, in a situation like this. Uh, these people will ultimately have paid a lot, but will have nothing to show when it comes to, if there were forcible acquisition of these properties.
Yeah. Shall I answer the two questions? Great. So yeah, no, thanks for the question, Mukta. And about stability, obviously, I make that claim with reservations. But I think that even in the current context, the biggest fear is targeting of specific people or specific places, as opposed to like wholesale threats of eviction for bastis in Hyderabad. So, some of the places that I've worked in are contiguous stretches of 35 bastis, 20 bastis with like 100,000 voters and so on. So they have themselves expressed that, they faced in the past pressures of eviction and so on. And they've in various ways said that we don't feel that threat anymore, at least not on a large scale, that there may be pockets or there may be edges that will be threatened, but not the whole. But yeah, so a very reserved claim like that. But so it does have everything to do with how the state engages with these kinds of claims, right? So the land administration in Hyderabad is well aware of something like no entry existing. People have pattas, some people have pattas that they've given them, but they know that many people will sell them and create no entry properties. And my argument is that there are many lost opportunities there in terms of what the state can do. So, that 80% to 100% certification, which even I think 80% is a bit of a stretch, but, I think it was really interesting to hear that from a broker, and it's provocative. But I think that there are other ways in which those differences could be addressed, but there's an unwillingness to actually recognize, and I think that goes back to the processes of differentiation, the caste prejudice, the racialization of these spaces that occurs. That's kind of where I'm coming from. But yes, and that becomes very apparent in a case like Bulldozer Raj, where it targets a few houses or a few settlements in a spectacular way. So that potential is there in Hyderabad also, sadly. On the question of having nothing to show or not being eligible for compensation, yes, absolutely, that's one of the biggest things. People could live in the same place for 50 years, but the rules of adverse possession, or a Lockean idea that, oh, now that they have invested their labor and money in it for so long, they have some right, is not recognized, simply because of where they are or what kinds of documentary regime they're within. And I think that that goes deep into mm, the slum governance of Indian cities, and it's at the core of that, which is why property has become so central to my research. And compensation often becomes the place where you see it, because the government's initial response is always, no, you don't deserve compensation, and then there's a dharna, or there's a sit-in or something like that, this protest, and then they will give compensation as sort of political move. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks. Later, in your presentation, you're saying this, you're making this claim about how racial and caste and these kind of things matter, but it's not something that you really highlighted, from your
Yeah,
feedback. So you don't have to say that now, but that's a question in my mind, which we can discuss if there is time.
sure.
But right now we have Mariam with us. So Mariam, you can just unmute and ask your question. And thanks,
Oh,
Rosama, for your question.
am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so basically, I'm studying on similar lines for city of Kolkata. So I just had a question because at least for Kolkata, the stability of this kind of a tenure is more related. What I feel is more related to the vote bank politics. So I don't know, like whether it is similar in context of what do you say, Hyderabad or not. But this threat of eviction and versus the citizenship, which is just like trying to claim a property or something based on the vote bank, for that politics that is there. I think it is like two different this thing, because the same state who provides the stability for this kind of a tenure, if there is a chance of a more like corridor development or a more neoliberal development, then the same stability like goes down the road, and then the threat of eviction, because then like what do you say, the land acquisition comes into play by the state. So is it like similar, like the stability is dependent on this vote bank politics, because there is definitely political collusion that is going on.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. So one of the things that I want to argue in the larger work is that yes, it is very much reliant on politics. I wouldn't just say vote bank politics. I would say in general democratic politics and the feedback between governed and the government, more like political society kind of things. And that is important and that is crucial to this process, but it's not the only thing happening. I think that that's a to to me, at least in the Hyderabad scenario, I began with that kind of understanding and found it ultimately does not explain certain things. So, for example, in Hyderabad, I mentioned that there are these regularization drives where the government will give people in slums pattas occasionally. Now, it's not just that they give them occasionally, but I found that since 1975, they have given them routinely every uh, every 4 or 5 years, or at some interval of time, and every government has done it, and that has not. And Hyderabad's government keeps shifting. There's a lot of it's not that there's one party ruling the roost in Hyderabad. The governments have kept shifting. So even though governments come forward with these kinds of schemes in a sort of populist way, it's not necessarily guaranteeing that they'll win, but nonetheless, they'll come back and do it again. So I think that there's more, and I kind of argue that there's a demand politics from below, and that we need to take seriously the sort of material practices of settlement and the sort of ways in which people are organized to gain recognition from the state beyond just the political patronage structure. That there is more happening. They are organizing as welfare associations, they're organizing as caste associations, they're organizing as taxpayers. They're making very many different kinds of claims to argue that they deserve recognition in the city. And I think that that also is working to some extent. So I hope I answered your question. But yes, definitely, politics, but there's also more than that.
Thanks, Indivar. There is a question by an anonymous, attendee about whether the no entry documents make transfer of property within the local area difficult. And if not state, but private players want to acquire the land, are the slum people compensated by showing these no entry documents? So that's a pretty, sort of follow-on question of this. And then we can move to Anshul, who has a more reflective sort of.
Sure. Yeah, so definitely there's a limit to the scope of these properties, as I was saying. But I think that for people wanting to live in the Basti, it's the go-to kind of approach, and in fact, it's taken for granted. Like you hear no entry thrown around very frequently, and as a sort of matter of fact thing. Yeah, it's a no entry. We just moved here. We bought this from someone. So within the area, definitely it allows for these transfers to happen, or for people coming in from outside. If someone were to try to then like take a no entry property that's in the middle of a basti and get it registered, that's a more complicated question that I've not really come across, or that has not occurred, because they don't see it as being prudent or expeditious to try to do that. What would be the point? But yes, if big private players are coming in, would people be compensated with these no entry documents? It depends. So in general, compensation is given to owners, and that ownership can be read in different ways. So in some places, no entry would be seen as owners, but they're not necessarily being compensated as owners necessarily, but just as being people being displaced. It's a humanitarian thing rather than a civic thing. So there could be, but it would raise questions, because someone who maybe had a patta beforehand, there's always this fear that they'll come forward and say, but this is actually ours and this was an illegal sale.
Thanks, and thanks for that question too. So I have Anshul and Rohit. Maybe we can, and Partho also has his hands up. It may be worth taking the questions in a bunch, just
Sure.
so that, I mean, some of the themes, of course, will do start repeating after a bit. Anshul, why don't you unmute yourself and go first, because Anshul's question is a little different. It's more about positionality than about your
Sure.
approach. Anshul, go ahead if you
Yeah,
can.
my question is, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you for the session, Indivar. And my question is about fieldwork and how a researcher can locate themselves within the politics of urban governance. The first scene that you began with, I'm curious about, because you center yourself there, and it is your reaction to the processes in the lawyer's office that actually lead you to explore the performative aspects of your partner later on. So that I'm interested in this idea of the researcher reacting to things within the field, and the politics coming to the, I mean, the politics of the researcher being expressed in the field. And I'm
Sure.
curious how one sustains that,
Mhm.
and how one balances that. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. So, as a I call myself an ethnographer, and I think that what makes ethnography different is, in contrast to, for example, like creating a survey with which I go to many people and trying to find aggregate sort of attitudes to things that are out there, right? I'm trying to find, okay, what is the attitude to something? And I'll interview a bunch of people and see what are the patterns that emerge. In ethnography, I think it's a little more um, performative in the sense that I'm not necessarily going to people asking them questions expecting that they have a ready-made attitude, but rather that I'm also eliciting things from them. Sometimes people are thinking about these questions I'm asking for the first time, like, what do you think about this property title? And they're like, oh, no one's asked us that before, but now that you're asking it, it's useless. Um, you know, um, so I think in that sense, then centering, not the point is not to center the ethnographer, but the point is to be reflexive about who the ethnographer is and how they learn and experience things in the field becomes a part of the writing process, and is one feature of ethnographic writing. And yes, I think I write about this in my manuscript and in other places too. I think that demands reflects not just reflexivity, but a certain ethical and political attunement. So I like that you called it politics, where one does have to be mindful of how we're using some of these materials, these stories, how we what interpretations we're giving them. Do they fit with what people's aspirations are, or are we taking them in some abstract, unfamiliar direction? So these are things that I think about. And in my work, I was very lucky to, be part of HUL, for example, through whom I had access to networks where there was trust. And through this sort of networked process, I often met people who were willing to trust me and willing to give me this information. But for example, even yesterday, I spoke to someone in Hyderabad, and someone I'd interviewed in the past, and asked her if it was okay that I was speaking about some things that I'd learned from her. And so I think that it's a continuous process, and it's an iterative process, and um, definitely one needs to be very mindful of extractive tendencies in ethnography.
Thank you. Thank you, Anshul, for asking that question. I think it's good to take a pause and think about how to be reflexive. I'm going to get Rohit in. Rohit, do you want to ask? And Partho and Isha also have questions. So maybe we can take this as a group. If it's too heavy, it's okay. We can take it one by one, but just let me know
Sure.
if it's too, if people have multiple questions, we may split. But Rohit, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Great. Thanks, Hi Mukta. Thanks, Indivar. Great presentation. So, my question actually was, I wanted to understand like your thoughts based on your ethnographic studies. Like, what can be the alternative ways we can look at providing tenure security, especially from a regulatory policy framework while working with the state, cities, central government? More like from an implementation point of view, what are your thoughts? Like, for example, like the slum networking project in Ahmedabad was something which was a very interesting way to look at providing 10-year no eviction guarantee, right? So, what can be other alternative is because like the whole spectrum of gray area that you pointed out between legality, illegality is something which I have also tried to explore in my paper, where I've tried to examine a range of indicators that influence perceived tenure security in informal settlements beyond just the idea of titling or giving someone a title or patta. So, yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for that question, and your work sounds really interesting. I will say that I haven't really studied all the existing policy frameworks in a comprehensive way, so I don't know if I have a suggestion that might be generalizable about what can be done. But let me speak to the case of Hyderabad, right? So in Hyderabad, you had a government come in 2014 and undertake land titling, and they gave pattas to various people in bastis of Hyderabad. But they also had this other program to provide housing, to provide 2 BHK housing. And now they were pursuing that. And what they wanted to do was create new 2 BHK housing somewhere in the city where people who maybe do not currently have pattas or houses could be, allotted houses. But they weren't able to find a lot of land, and then they opted to do in situ redevelopment. And they have done a lot of in situ redevelopment in Hyderabad. The catch being that actually in many places people didn't want it because they had pattas, because they had their own rights, their own land, they developed their own housing. They did not want to be redeveloped and put into apartments, but then they lose their stake in the land, and they are now reliant on the government to maintain the infrastructure of the building. But nonetheless, it was pushed through in many places. Some places successfully resisted, and others pushed through. So I think my sense is that there needs to be a more serious recognition of these possessory property claims than this sort of business as usual subordination and neglect of these as property rights. Any time that people have gotten any kind of compensation or rights in such kinds of interactions between the state and the poor, I think have generally been in humanitarian terms, or have come down to that, as opposed or being political negotiations, as opposed to actually being some kind of recognition. So I think that's my biggest sort of recommendation is we need, and how that gets implemented or how that gets encoded, I don't have the skills and the research to say yet. But I think that recognition is really important. Sorry, I was supposed to take questions 3 at a time. I'm just.
It's fine. They're pretty loaded. It's fine. Whatever you're comfortable with. Thanks, Rohit. We'll move on to Partho. Partho, do you want to come in? And I think then we can take Isha's and Vasudha's together because again they're quite interlinked. But Partho may have a nested set of questions. So warning.
Why don't you go with Isha and Vasudha and I'll come in after that.
Okay. Isha, do you want to come in? I know Isha she messaged me saying there was a power cut situation. Hyderabad, load shedding, sounds familiar.
Thankfully not where I am.
No, Isha did. She's in Hyderabad too. But Isha, do you want to come in? Can you unmute and speak now?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Endeavor, and thanks for this fascinating talk. And I was making a lot of connections to my work with Mukta actually on housing finance in Delhi. But that's less of the technical question here right now. And I actually wanted to go back to your opening vignette, which was very striking to me. And also because of the way you describe and ask those reflexive questions about what am I doing in this office, accompanying your interlocutor. And there is a very telling comment. There is a lot of assumption in the bureaucrats' Telugu comment. And there is validation of your silence. But at the same time, to me, the exchange that has happened in the office and which then stresses on to the conversation in the bike and the discussion is actually beyond also your like sometimes reflexivity in ethnography boils down to reflexivity of the ethnographer and ethnographer alone. But in my reading, that is not what has happened because there is reflexivity in terms of your interrelationship to your interlocutor. And as I know from the conversations we've had, these are not just relationships. These are also long-term relationships you have built and sustained. So from my vantage point, there is also a lot about questions around observation versus intervention. Should I intervene? Should I not intervene? Silences versus being vocal about. And often to me, the issue is that many of us are trained to believe that we are only going to observe and that we have nothing to intervene. And also many of us are sometimes trained to ask, who are we to be speaking up? Okay. But sometimes that can be counterintuitive to the larger question of, because this is to me essentially also a way through which a larger agitation is being co-made by you and your interlocutor. So there is a larger question of not just reflexivity, but also building, sustaining, and working through tensions in these ethnographic relationships. So I was hoping if you could speak a bit more about that, because standard ethnographic understandings would reduce this to reflexivity on your part. But
Sure.
I'm afraid that it's a lot beyond that, which standard ethnographic understandings cannot allow us to understand. So
Totally.
sorry, it's a bit loaded perhaps, and maybe a bit spread over, but I mean, to me, it was really striking. And the conversation that actually ensued after that has strong components
Yeah.
of what ethical relationships should then look like.
Totally.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks.
Vasudha, do you also want to add your question in? You can unmute yourself and speak. Are you here, Vasudha? So essentially, I'll read her question out.
Yeah.
She wants to understand how the understanding that you've gained through this process will go back to the people on the ground who've shared their experiences with you, so that they are better able to negotiate the legal processes. So she has a more pragmatic side to this
Sure.
question.
Yeah.
Giving back.
Totally. Yeah. No, thanks for both these questions. Yeah, on the question of reflexivity, Isha, I agree that reflexivity is can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. I was.
Oh, yeah, Vasudha.
Hi.
You can ask it in your own words if that's better. I just read out your question.
Yeah. So I mean, it is just building on from the question that the previous person asked, and I mean, my question is more like, I mean, I understand the question about being observatorial in the field, but also what has been observed in the field, how will it go back to the people whose lives are being studied, how they can basically understand and then negotiate with the processes that they are having to, so that all this study that has been undertaken, how they can utilize that, because I'm not sure if they would be able to
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, access these forums, basically. That's all.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll answer them in the order in which they came. So I agree with Isha that reflexivity is not an adequate frame to think about ethnographic fieldwork. And, on this, I'm following many anthropologists who have talked about this. And, I prefer to think of it as ethical and political attunements to the spaces that one is in and the people that one is working with. And often I'm taking my lead from them. So, for example, I remember while doing fieldwork at a in situ redevelopment site, one of my interlocutors kind of roped me into this interrogation of the engineer on site, and made me pose for a picture with the engineer, saying that this scholar from the US has inspected the site and so on. And, so in those situations, I'm kind of thinking about, okay, what is my presence here doing? And I was happy to be in that photograph and be open to those kinds of involvements, but of course it gets complicated. I'm nowhere saying that ethnography is only observation. In this case, I was expecting it to be less eventful than it was. So that's why I said I was expecting to mostly observe. Um, but otherwise, yeah, there is a lot of co-construction of what's happening. The relationship is really salient. And yeah, so there are various kinds of questions that one needs to ask oneself both while doing the research and while writing it up. And hopefully you would have engagements, but not always. So I have a lot of interlocutors who have not been interested in a long-term relationship, and that's totally fine. Also, even the short term was like they set the limits, and in that sense, I look to them. But I also am sort of would try to read signs in all kinds of ways about, okay, how much do they want me here, and what is the extent to which I can learn something here. So that's what I would say. Definitely not saying that if you are in a situation where your intervention could make a difference, I think you should do it because you are in a political situation. Ethnography is not necessarily a fly on the wall business. So yeah, Isha, I agree with you on that. As for the question about how information goes back to the field, yeah, that's a great question, and ideally, I think I would want some of my frameworks to maybe return to the field. Because a lot of the things that I write about are actually knowledge that people have and practices that people carry out. I don't think the mechanics is necessarily something that would interest them, but I think the framing, the analysis is something that could be useful, and making that accessible is an important thing. And there's a couple of ways in which this can happen. So in my work, through sort of networked field work that I've been doing, it's just the coming back, the returning, the being part of the network, being engaged with the network, sharing what I'm doing, sharing my publications with some kind of explanation in simpler terms of what I'm trying to argue, gives them a document, for example, where they can be like, look, this document argues this point, things like that. And I think that has been one way in which I would approach it. But yeah, there's obviously much more to do. Translation of or writing in Telugu or Urdu are among my aspirations. I'll get there, or getting some of the work translated, or writing for a more popular audience. I think there's many audiences here, and it's not just the people who I work with who need to understand some of these things, but others outside academia too, I think. So yeah, that I hope that answers your question, at least to a degree.
Thanks. You need a water break. I was just going to say that. That's a lot of talking. Partho, I think we've come to you finally. Thank you, Isha and Vasudha.
Hi, Endeavor. Good to see you there. Uh, so I mean, just to sort of take sort of some context in this conversation, which is two kinds of things. One, to sort of reflect on Rosama's first question, which is, a lot of the times when long settled households do not have documentation, that is because of the nature of urban incorporation we have in this country, where boundaries are extended to include former village lands, but while villages are surveyed for agricultural land, uh, sort of the sort of village residential areas are not surveyed, and as a result, oftentimes people, when their villages come into the urban boundary, do not receive appropriate documentation. The first thing is that something that you have all encountered, but in many places, some of that stuff is happening. The other story, as we just to point out, is that over the course of the last few years, we have had about a few 100,000 houses which have been built under what we call the beneficiary-led construction program of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. And that beneficiary-led construction program is essentially something that requires some form of land documentation before they're able to provide you with that particular loan, which is about a couple of lakhs and sometimes more in some cases. So the second question is that there are processes in place which do seem to be such that a large in a large number of situations, not in metropolitan cities, but in smaller cities. By small, it could be fairly large. So something like this might happen in Kakinada, but not in Vishakhapatnam. You would, or it might happen in Karimnagar, but not in Hyderabad. You'll have a situation where that land documentation would be recognized and the person would be given a loan or not a loan, but definitely.
Partha, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. So there are so some of these issues that sort of the no entry issues that sort of come up are in some sense more concentrated in these larger places where the value of land is high, and therefore obviously the kind of structure that is 80%, 50% of a relatively large number is still worth risking a certain amount of money for, right? And which is also why, as you said, most of in Hyderabad, people were happier, the governments were happier trying to provide housing schemes that were large and separate, but outside these core urban spaces. With the core urban spaces, they were very reluctant to sort of recognize and award the kind of beneficiary land programs that were actually there.
Right.
So within so I think it's useful. The point I'm making here is might be useful for you to intersect this rollout of these large kinds of programs and sort of use that as a lens through which to understand what the manner in which the government looks at legality or legal pluralism in different contexts. Right? That's the so the rural stuff and then the urban stuff, and then I mean, these two I think are core to what we are thinking of as of now, and I was just wondering how you would respond to this aspect.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions and suggestions and reflections. Let me take it in parts. So so the first thing you'd mentioned that there are village household areas that don't get surveyed and perhaps when they get incorporated into the city. So that's not an area that I've worked firsthand. There are village kind of spaces that have been incorporated into Hyderabad as well, but I've not really looked at the property in those. I've mostly focused on no entry and pattas within notified slum settlements, mostly in the core city. So there's an interesting dynamic in Hyderabad where, at a time when Mumbai or Delhi or the cities were opting for resettlement, as far back as the 70s or 80s, Hyderabad actually opted for a different model, which was this kind of like upgradation and titling on a pretty large scale. So today you see in the city, the numbers say something like 100,000 people have these pattas, and it has been done over time, routinely, as I mentioned. So that's mostly what I focused on. So I don't really have a sense of the villages and their incorporation, but that is definitely.
Endeavor, can I just sort of interrupt? I'm
Sure.
sorry. In your fieldwork, did you get any sense that this history of awarding pattas, also happened a couple of other places, uh, is that something that is sustaining the kind of belief that these no entries will eventually be transformed into something? And if Hyderabad had not had these kinds of programs before, that this kind of um, documentation would be less desirable or valuable, or maybe this market may not have existed?
Yes, yeah, I do think so. I talk about it as a moral economy of land in Hyderabad over the years, where there has been this give and take, and there have been routine distributions of pattas and so on. So it has become a structural feature of, regularization is not a exceptional thing that a party does to gain favor, but it's kind of become part of the uh, structure of governance itself, and that does make it attractive. And there is a lot of hope and a lot of aspirations in the fact that no entry can one day become something else. So yes, definitely, that history bears heavily on the current markets in the city. And even the fact that these markets are so big that they are everywhere when people talk about them, prices are quite high. So in one of the areas where I work, which is near Jubilee Hills, people would say that it's, the rates are only a little less than in Jubilee Hills to buy property there. The units are much smaller, so the cost might be affordable through loans, or not affordable, but they're able to assemble the money. But their asking rate is very high. I think it has to do with this history and this potential for regularization. And so coming back to some of the other questions that you'd asked. Thank you for bringing up the beneficiary-led construction program. So yeah, as you'd mentioned, it has not happened in Hyderabad. In Hyderabad, the PMAY funds went into the two-bedroom, 2 BHK dignity housing scheme of the BRS party, but not so much any kind of beneficiary-led construction program that might have happened in other parts of the state. So yeah, I'm actually intrigued to hear you say that in these situations, the government would potentially, or in some cases, maybe recognize, not the full, or something like a no entry to give people funds under this scheme. And I can totally see that happening in different places. But the other thing about it, though, is that I know that in Andhra Pradesh, a similar thing has been done, and there were land plots given and construction money, and the new Congress government in Telangana also similarly has a scheme to give people money to construct houses if they have land. And my guess is that they will do this on the backs of the same kinds of titling programs, which will be these non-transferable pattas. And so these will become no entry spaces ultimately. And no entry has stretched far beyond the core of Hyderabad. So, I meet people who live on rent here and have no entry properties in small towns like Bidar, or towns like Bidar or Gulbarga, which are even in a different state, but definitely Sangareddy and Zahirabad and so on. So and they also call it no entry in this sort of whole region. So there is this sort of parallel development economy of sorts, which is anchored in these legal differentiations that I think calls for some questions, and or some investigations in terms of policy approaches. And I actually don't know if the beneficiary-led housing thing would result in a non-transferable patta, but that's my guess, and I know that in Andhra that is definitely the case. But please correct me if I'm wrong, and I will look more into this. This is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you have instances outside of Hyderabad, because you see, you've had roughly about 7.5 million beneficiary-led construction houses that have been sanctioned,
Wow.
of which about 5 million have already been constructed. So my sense is that I doubt, given the state of our land registration records, that all these 5 million have quote unquote full formal
Sure. Clear rights.
titles of the kinds that we're talking about. So they will all have some gradation of title.
Yeah.
But and it might be a useful thing to sort of, since you're looking at this.
Yes.
And the hypothesis would be that as you go into the smaller cities, perhaps the degree of formality might sort of become slightly more gray as opposed to light gray, dark gray, black kind of structure as we go forward. So that's one of sort of the hypothesis that goes forward, and all of this is essentially, obviously, in with the concurrence of the state, because this is money that is being released by the structures going forward, and you can bring it back to vote bank politics. You can bring it back to a certain democratic rights regime, whichever lens you would like to put forward. But it is something that might be useful to sort of explore.
Definitely.
If nothing else, to provide a certain small bright spot in the kind of narratives we actually have about structures going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll just jump in here. This is really interesting, this question of this. Emily Rains' work is talking also about this question of tenure sort of gradations and how property documents. I mean, I was reminded of when you were showing the images of your thing, they have done this whole archive of images of different kinds of, you've looked at it, right? Rains and Krishna. So, but this idea of the ladder of security, of ladder of tenure has been around for a while in the housing practice space. And we got the opportunity to look at Ranchi. And some of our colleagues in CPR were working on, of course, on the Jaga mission. So my sense is really there's a lot of state-wise variation also here that figures into this, and Partho's provocation that a lot of the BLC houses may actually not have a full title is interesting and important, because what we found in Ranchi was that the older version, which is the RAY, actually allowed for people who had tribal lands in the middle of the city, I mean, in the city limits, to do some workarounds and bring the title to a good enough state to be able to access the government schemes. But they were not able to do that under BLC. They had a higher ask.
Right.
So all these kind of little things from scheme to scheme, and how this sort of how it's implemented is also really fascinating. And it would be great to do at some point of time a collation of, I'm sure many across states are working on the same issue, and to just collate all of that work and give some sort of a sense of how these things have been negotiated in different places. Because in the Delhi region, Isha referred to our work before, it's the power of attorney, that which sounds very similar to the what you talk about, to the no entry, which is ubiquitous, and everyone's is happily trading their properties on these power of attorneys, but the land revenue department will not accept it. It cannot be registered, essentially.
Right.
We found the same in Ranchi. And so this seems to be we also found there's a disconnect between the urban development thinking and the land revenue thinking within the state. So that's
Yes.
also some, the ethnography of these institutions is also maybe
Yes.
an area of work that
Yeah.
could be done. Yeah, any concluding comments?
Sure.
Because of course responses to Partho's
Yes.
latest comments, but anything else concluding and then after that we close.
No, thank you so much. So yeah, basically, I would also love to collate and compare this across contexts. I know something like no entry exists in many places. It would be great to kind of understand what are the possibilities or trajectories in different places. I think that's a collaboration I want to have. So write to me if that's you. And similarly with schemes and pattas also, I know pattas were given out in Odisha not long ago, and it's definitely a popular thing because it makes governments look very good. And they are able to celebrate that in a certain way and like promote themselves as a pro-poor. But I think the outcomes are actually complicated, and my work is kind of to open up this question about what are the outcomes of this, because usually the in my study of the archives of Hyderabad or the ethnography in Hyderabad, no one's actually asking what difference has it made. Everyone's just like, we did this great titling drive, and it's like, okay, what did it do? And mostly, there's not a not a consciousness about asking that question, because it's like that's enough. It's for poor people. And then the revenue department is a place where you hear a lot of this. So when I talk to them about these property rights, they'd be like, but why should they have more than this, or judgments like that, or judgments about economic capacity and capability, which is again what I'm trying to highlight. But yes, definitely more scope for comparative work. Minus sort of in-depth case of Hyderabad, which is a very interesting site because there's so much property stuff happening. And so yeah, hopefully it provides some sparks, some provocations for people in other places as well. Thank you so much for this invitation. This is an honor.
Yeah, thank you for, it's already clearly provoked a lot of thought in just today's session. So thank you so much for that. And I know that your paper, your work is still in progress and you will be writing this up in the future. So I hope some of these thoughts and ideas were helpful to you as well.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
thanks, not the least, thank you to our audience for hanging in there. And we started with about roughly double this number, but it's nearly 5:30 and folks are still here
Yes.
with us. So thank you so much for taking
Thank
time.
you so much. Yes.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.